I'm always happy to do track breakdowns if I get requests, so don't hesitate to ask if there's a track you're curious about. We'll take a listen to the source samples that I used for perspectives. The heavily distorted bass sound is the only sound that is not produced by manipulating a loop. The source is a single-cycle waveform from Adventure Kid. Looks a bit like a blend between a square and a wave-folded sine that has been heavily clipped. This next source sample is a melody loop from the hip-hop section of the stock Loop Masters loops. Just a basic and cheesy synth riff, but easily repurposed. The drums are a loop from the dub category, another rather generic and fairly basic sample, but that's part of what's great about it. And the final sample that I used is one of the vocal samples in the dub section of the stock samples.
From the top to the very last drop, from the top to the very last drop, from the top to the very last drop.
Now that we've had a chance to hear the source sounds without any transformation, we'll start by examining how I worked with the drum loop, which is mainly through an approach we might refer to as resequencing through modulation. We'll take a look at the waveform here and get a better visual of what's happening. This loop resequencing behavior is happening primarily through the application of LFOs on the start position. There's also a small amount of modulation on the retrigger and retrigger time to introduce additional slight variations. Using a ramp LFO here on the start time will help select different parts of the loop in a linear fashion. This flex machine has loop to on and time stretch to off in the playback setup page. Notice the very small amount of modulation applied to retrigger and retrigger time. I didn't end up slicing any of the loops for this project. Every time I tried it, it didn't give me quite the result I was looking for. On the drum loop flex machine, there is a DJ EQ feeding a filter, and on the neighbor machine track, there is a compressor and a plate reverb with no P-locks or modulation. The P-locks on the drum track trigs are primarily used to control the effect of the start position modulation on particular steps in the pattern by setting different LFO depths and start positions for different trigs. There are also a few triggers with conditions on them to help introduce additional variation. You can see that key steps in the pattern have the LFO depth to 0 to disable the start position modulation. And here are the start position P-locks in this drum loop pattern. Sneaky pitch lock right here. Now we'll check for some trigger conditions because I don't remember exactly. Take a glance at that compressor and reverb on the drums. As we take a listen to some of the transformations the scenes produce, an extremely important thing to realize is that scene locks take priority over parameter locks. So as usual for scene 16, I have it doing a sort of breakdown variation, where the drum track is heavily filtered and transformed. Most of the other scenes are primarily to produce groove and fill variations. I did not end up using all of the scenes to record the performance. Here you can see where I've set the LFO depths to 0. A lot of variation possible just changing the default start position as well as the LFO depths and playback direction. And of course I'm using retriggering and retrigger time modulation to spice the rhythms up. Let's take a look at the waveform while I change some of the scenes. Given all the rhythmic variations produced by the scenes, timing of the activation is very crucial for getting the right phrasing. When I have scenes that can strongly affect the phrasing like this, I'll lot of my time spent preparing for recording a performance often has to do with exploring the different variations possible through different scene timing changes. On the vocal sample, I'm also employing this resequencing through modulation technique. I have a comb filter and a reverb on this track, and I'm mostly sending short bursts of the vocals through to ping the comb filter and create resonant textures. I'm modulating the start time of the sample, the release time of the amplitude envelope, and the playback direction of the sample. Unlike the drum track, there are no LFO P-locks on the vocal sample track, and the P-locks are used primarily to sequence the pitches produced by the comb filter, as well as repitching the sample. For this flex machine, I have time stretch off and loop set to ping pong. Unlike the drum loop track, this one has no P-locks on the LFOs. On this sound, as well as on a few other sounds, you'll notice I've done a bit of panning P-locks. We'll take a look at the playback page P-locks. The handful of scenes where I put scene locks in for this sound mainly control the start position and start position modulation, along with the comb filter and amplitude envelope, to give variations on the pitches and articulations produced. However, I didn't program nearly as much variation into these scenes as I did on the drum loop track. Since this vocal sample is pinging a comb filter, the scene locks on the amplitude envelope page are very important. For the single cycle bass sound, the only changes to the default flex machine playback setup are to have time stretch off and loop to on. For effects on this source track, I have a filter feeding a delay with the tape setting to off. No conditional trigs are used for this track, and very few P-locks as well. Modulation is routed to control the amplitude envelope release time and the filter width. The filter modulation on the bass sound will only be activated by scenes, as the depth of the associated LFO is 0. Not very many P-locks. Overall, a rather simple pattern. Only the very last trig even has any parameter locks for the filter. There's a very important P-lock here that sends into the delay with high feedback. Rhythmic variation in this sound that comes from using the scenes is created primarily through release time changes interacting with delay time changes. Additional timbral variation is also accessed via scene locks on the lo-fi effect on the neighbor effects machine. Scene locks on the lo-fi effect have a big impact on the bass sound. The final effect on this distorted bass's audio processing chain is a compressor. It doesn't get any scene locks or parameter locks. And here are some of those delay scene locks. And as I noted before, an important change from the default delay setting is that I have the tape setting off. So let's take a listen to the default resequenced melody loop. This Flex machine has loop set to ping pong and time stretch off. The source Flex machine track has a flanger feeding a delay. A few key parameter locks snuck in here and there. On this track, I have the LFOs routed to modulate the amplitude envelope release time, attack time, and the playback start position. This gives me a lot of variation and control over the articulations produced. Like the vocal sample, I did not use any LFO P-locks. On the neighbor machine track, I have a filter and a dark reverb. There's a sneaky effects send to the reverb at the end of this one. I have a few parameter locks on the filter as well. As I often like to do, notice I'm using the filter envelope. All of the LFOs on this neighbor track are for the filter. Just simple triangle modulation. No P-locks for the LFOs here. Let's check out some of the scenes for this sound. Let's take a look at it in the audio editor. In addition to the typical loop resequencing modulation, lots of different changes to the time-based effects. Let's take a look at that flanger. I have lots of scene locks on the delay also, of course. Take a look at the dark reverb scene locks. Not many of these, but there are a few. Some scenes with locks on the filter as well. Now time to take a look at how these tracks are working together. This was the intro section that immediately goes into the primary breakdown scene. There we go, breaking it down. For the scene that begins the next section, I debated a bit whether I wanted to start it on the end before the 1 or on the 1 of the next bar. Depending on what transformations you're doing with your scenes, precise timing of scene changes can be very important. I'm not really going to try to mimic my arrangement from the performance video, partially because I don't remember it exactly, but also because I'm curious what new things might come up. I snuck a secondary breakdown scene in there. I'll just quickly flip through some of the scenes now. I think it's time to bring in the bass sound now. Now time for that synth riff. So now that you've heard all these messy scene changes, you probably have a good idea why I didn't use any of these scene modulation. For this track, the scene modulation mainly served as inspiration for developing the variations in the scenes. When it came time to actually recording the performance, the scene modulation just didn't work out for the phrasing and overall structure that I wanted for the track. Each one of these muted MIDI tracks produces a slightly different scene modulation pattern. It's fun to feel around in the middle of the crossfader when you're altering the pitches on different things. See if you can find a nice sweet spot. Not working out too great for me right now though. In order to have this track work out with scene modulation, I would need to spend quite some time with how that's being controlled, and really that would have resulted in quite a different track overall. I didn't have any plan for these modulations when I was configuring them. I just wanted a lot of variety. There's a lot of performance control you could squeeze out of this approach though, especially by configuring multiple MIDI tracks and using the quick mute feature. And it's very easy to disable scene modulation by deactivating the scene slot. By having the MIDI tracks control additional MIDI CCs, you could even be using the MIDI tracks essentially as additional scenes in and of themselves, but ones that are acting directly on the default part settings. In this type of setup, quick mute and part reload become even more powerful performance features, and represents a very interesting paradigm for both exploration and exploitation. Oops, I almost forgot. On the master track, I have a compressor and a dark reverb. The compressor is set fairly aggressively, only a very small amount of reverb though. I think it's interesting to note that I recorded this track with the Octatrack set to 16 bits. Normally I have it set to 24 bits, but it sounded much more punchy and aggressive at 16-bit, although generally the Octatrack sounds much better to me when set in 24-bit.